I bought this condemned pottery room, but one cork was far too heavy.
No car, no bed, no address. Just a canvas satchel and $6 she had preserved by missing suppers while sleeping behind a Steubenville laundromat. With that $6, she bought an abandoned porcelain tooth powder jar room near East Liverpool, Columbiana County, Ohio, erased from working maps when its pottery closed in 1938. One roof beam had split above the kiln. White glazed dust lay damp across the floor. The county condemned it on April 3, 1954, and scheduled demolition for the coming autumn. Yet behind a pale blue glaze-sample drawer sat a cedar compartment unopened for decades, holding an oversized cork stopper whose contents would alter every choice Hazel made. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hazel Quinn had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a girl, she measured rain by the darkening boards beneath the porch gutter, and winter by the number of coal pieces left beside the stove. Her dresses came from flour sacks. Her school pencils were used down to the ferrule, and nothing in the Quinn household was discarded until her mother had tested whether it might serve another purpose. May Quinn worked long shifts glazing small porcelain containers for drugstores along the Ohio River. In the evening, she brought home chalky fingerprints around her cuffs, and sometimes a rejected jar whose lip had warped in the kiln. She taught Hazel that a flaw seen early was merely work. A flaw ignored became waste. The finer lessons came from Hazel's grandmother, Iris Quinn, who had spent 43 years preparing glaze at the Mercer Dental Ware Room outside East Liverpool. Every Saturday, Iris cleared her kitchen table, spread newspaper beneath 3 chipped mixing bowls, and showed Hazel how water changed a glaze before color ever did. They stirred feldspar, kaolin, and silica with handles worn smooth by use. Iris dipped broken porcelain rings into each batch, scratched numbers beneath them, then fired the samples in a little brick test kiln behind her house. While the kiln cooled, they shaped cork stoppers against narrow jar mouths. Iris turned each stopper a quarter rotation, listening for the dry whisper that meant a proper seal. Too loose, and tooth powder gathered moisture. Too tight, and the porcelain neck cracked when the cork swelled. Honest work leaves room for what the material knows. Iris meant that skill was not the forcing of an object into obedience. It was the patience to notice what heat, clay, water, and cork had already decided. She died during a wet March, when Hazel was 17. By the time Hazel and May reached Iris's rented house, the landlord had emptied the workshed. Her test rings, notebooks, trimming knives, and brass scale had gone into auction boxes. May recovered only a blue apron from a kitchen hook. She folded it once and never wore it. After Iris's death, May moved them into the narrow house of her older sister, Ruth Bell. Ruth kept her furniture beneath fitted covers and recorded every household expense in a black ledger. She spoke quietly, but every favor returned later as a number. A cup left beside the sink became evidence of carelessness. A lamp burning after 10 became a lecture about gratitude. Even silence seemed to belong to her. Hazel worked at a pharmacy warehouse in Wellsville and saved enough to buy a 12-year-old Ford. The car was plain, reliable, and entirely hers. On Monday, September 8th, she came home to find its parking place empty. Ruth sat at the dining table with the black ledger open. A brass key rested upon the page where Hazel's name had been written. "You owe me for every night you stayed." 8 words. Ruth had sold the Ford that morning to settle a debt she had taken out under her own name. She called the sale repayment for food, heat, and the use of the upstairs room. Hazel looked towards May, who stood beside the china cabinet holding Iris's folded blue apron. May did not defend the sale. She did not meet Hazel's eyes. She smoothed one corner of the apron with her thumb, then placed it back inside the drawer. Hazel packed one dress, 2 blouses, a comb, and the rejected tooth powder jar May had given her years before. Ruth set Hazel's canvas satchel on the porch as though completing a household chore. The screen door closed between them, and its spring gave one tired metallic note. For the first week, Hazel remained in Wellsville, sleeping in a freight shed near the tracks until a railway watchman found her. She had $68.40, but without the Ford, she could not reach the warehouse before her shift. After her second late arrival, the supervisor replaced her. She walked north toward East Liverpool and paid 75 cents for a night in a women's lodging house. 2 nights later, the rate increased, and she moved beneath the covered loading platform behind a furniture store. Her money fell to $49. In Chester, across the West Virginia line, she washed cups at a lunch counter for meals and slept in a church basement until a leaking pipe forced everyone out. She returned to Ohio with $27, 1 blistered heel, and the canvas satchel pressed beneath her arm whenever she rested. By the 5th week, she was in Steubenville. The laundromat on Market Street vented warm air behind its brick wall until midnight, and Hazel learned to sleep there after the last attendant locked the rear door. She bought bread, apples, and a spool of thread. Her coat lining tore anyway. $12 became $9, then $7. She would not write to Ruth. She could not write to May without seeing the blue apron disappearing into the cabinet. On the 41st morning, rain drove Hazel into the Carnegie Public Library. She chose a chair beside a radiator and opened the classified pages, because doing so made her look occupied. Farm tools, rented rooms, and factory positions filled the columns. Near the bottom was a county notice printed in smaller type. Condemned Pottery outbuilding. For tax transfer, $6. Buyer assumes clearance or repair. The address named an old lane beyond East Liverpool. Someone had penciled 2 words beside the notice. Mercer Room. Hazel read them twice. Mercer was the name Iris had spoken over mixing bowls and test rings, usually when explaining where she had learned a difficult method. Hazel touched the porcelain jar inside her satchel and felt the faint ridge where its glaze had pooled beneath the neck. The library clock showed 9:20. The county office would remain open until 4. Hazel copied the address onto the back of a discarded catalog card, spent her final spare coins on the cheapest bus heading north, and kept $6 folded separately inside her shoe. By sunset, she was traveling toward the room where her grandmother's work had been waiting in silence. The bus carried Hazel north through a morning of low clouds, stopping often enough that walking might have seemed quicker if her heel had not begun bleeding again. She rode as far as Calcutta, then followed the shoulder of State Route 39 with her satchel against her ribs. The catalog card from the library softened in her palm as a thin rain crossed the hills. She covered 11 miles before darkness made the road difficult to judge. That night she entered an open hay barn beyond a fallow field. The temperature fell to 38 degrees. Hazel pushed loose straw beneath her coat, placed the porcelain jar inside her satchel where it could not freeze against the ground, and listened to cattle shifting behind a partition until sleep came. She resumed walking before the farmer appeared. East Liverpool rose above the Ohio River in brick terraces darkened by coal smoke and rain. Hazel passed Thompson's Drugstore, the Golden Star Dairy, Patterson Hardware, McNichol's Bakery, and a narrow storefront marked D.W. Keating Shoes. Workmen moved between pottery buildings carrying lunch tins. Nearly every curb seemed powdered with pale clay. The Columbiana County Property Office occupied 2 rooms beside a municipal records annex. Hazel entered at 3:14, wet to the knees and carrying all she owned. A woman behind this counter lifted her eyes from a deed book. She had silver spectacles attached to a black ribbon and a left index finger permanently stained with violet ink. The nameplate before her read Mrs. Edna Wilcox, Deputy Clerk. I came about the Mercer Pottery Room. Mrs. Wilcox studied the water dripping from Hazel's coat, then looked at the clock. The tax transfer notice? Hazel placed the $6 on the counter. Mrs. Wilcox did not touch the money. She removed her spectacles, cleaned them with a square of linen, and opened a brown folder tied with cotton tape. You understand, the building has no certified well? Yes, ma'am. You understand the privy has not been inspected since 1939? Yes, ma'am. You understand the kiln chimney may be unsafe to fire? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county can order demolition if you fail to begin repairs before October? Yes, ma'am. The clerk replaced her spectacles. And you intend to live there? I intend to keep it standing. For the first time, Mrs. Wilcox looked at Hazel rather than her clothes. She counted the bills and coins, wrote a receipt in a narrow hand, and drew 3 documents from the folder. Hazel signed where the clerk's ink-stained finger indicated. The transfer passed under a brass county stamp mounted on a lever. Mrs. Wilcox pulled it down with both hands. Metal met paper with a deliberate blow, leaving a raised seal over Hazel's name. Take Dresden Avenue east, she said. Turn north past the old sewer pipe yard, then follow Irish Ridge Road until you reach a lane with 2 stone posts. The western post has fallen. The room stands 7/10 of a mile beyond it. She slid the deed across the counter, but kept one hand upon its edge. Quinn, she said. Was Iris Quinn any relation? Hazel's wet fingers stopped above the paper. My grandmother. Mrs. Wilcox leaned back. The ribbon of her spectacles tightened against her collar. Iris worked in that room. Hazel had known the Mercer name, but she had pictured a larger factory, one of the long buildings near the river. She had not understood that the $6 room itself had held Iris's test kiln. Mrs. Wilcox opened a second ledger and turned several pages. In an employment column dated May 1936, she found Iris Quinn, glaze trials, weekend lots. Beside the entry was a notation in red pencil. Private formulae removed before closure. She came here after the pottery failed, Mrs. Wilcox said, asked whether anything from the sample room had been stored with the county. Drawers, test cards, mixing records. There was nothing in the file. She never told us she went looking. She may not have wanted to say she found nothing. Mrs. Wilcox released the deed. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her desk and gave Hazel a small iron key tied to a wooden tag. Mercer Sample Room had been burned into its surface. Your grandmother left this at the office in 1940. No one remembered why we kept it. Hazel closed her hand around the tag. Its corners had been rounded by years of handling. Outside, the rain had thinned. She followed Dresden Avenue through the eastern edge of town, passing houses built close to the road and yards where broken kiln bricks bordered flower beds. At Irish Ridge Road, afternoon light appeared beneath the clouds, turning the wet pavement the color of pewter. The route climbed steadily. Hazel counted mailboxes until the houses gave way to pasture and second-growth woods. Near the fallen stone post, a man in brown work trousers was repairing a fence with wire drawn from a wooden spool. A white dog stood beside him, its right ear folded forward. You looking for Mercer? The man asked. Hazel nodded. He pointed with his pliers. Lane's nearly gone. Keep left where it divides. Right fork ends at the clay pit. The dog approached, sniffed Hazel's satchel, then returned to the fence. Name's Walter Voss, the man said. That's Nell. My place is the next roof west. If the walnut limbs come down, they'll block your way before you hear them fall. Hazel thanked him and entered the lane. Black walnut trees crowded both sides, their leaves dripping upon weeds that had grown waist-high. The western stone post lay on its face beneath moss. Beyond it, the lane narrowed to 2 wheel ruts and then disappeared under goldenrod. The building emerged slowly from the trees, It was not a house, and had never pretended to be one. The sample room measured roughly 24 feet by 36, built of red kiln brick with limestone sills and a slate roof sagging above the eastern wall. A square chimney rose behind the cold test kiln, its top course missing 3 bricks. 2 windows were boarded. A third retained 1 greenish pane. Above the double door, faded letters remained on a porcelain sign. Mercer Dental and Toilet, Wear Glaze. Sample Room. Hazel stood beneath it until rainwater ran from the roof onto her shoulder. The iron key entered the lock, but would not turn. She pressed the door inward to lift its weight from the rusted bolt, then tried again. Something shifted inside with a long wooden complaint. The key turned halfway, stopped, and turned once more. The door opened 6 inches. Cool air touched her face. It smelled of wet brick, mouse nesting, and the mineral dryness of clay sealed away from daylight. Hazel leaned her shoulder against the door until a mound of fallen plaster moved across the floor. Inside, the late sun entered through the single pane and laid a green rectangle upon white dust. The front room held a work table, a cold iron stove, and shelves crowded with unfinished jars. Some stood upright in orderly rows. Others had fallen together, producing a faint porcelain ticking when the floor moved beneath Hazel's weight. She tasted old lime in the air and covered her mouth with her sleeve. Beneath the grit, the boards felt unexpectedly firm. Their creaks traveled ahead of her toward the rear wall, each note slightly different. A narrow doorway led to the workroom. There, the test kiln occupied one corner, no larger than a household oven, but faced with fire brick, darkened around its iron mouth. Wooden bins ran beneath the windows. A cabinet of shallow glaze-sample drawers covered most of the north wall. Hazel touched one brass pull. Powder came away on her fingertip, smooth as flour, but colder. She rubbed it between finger and thumb and recognized the faint drag of unfired glaze. The room had been abandoned, but not emptied. On a shelf beside the kiln rested dozens of cork stoppers sorted into wooden trays. Moisture had blackened several. Others remained pale and close-grained. Hazel lifted one, pressed it gently, and heard the small, dry sound Iris had taught her to seek. Somewhere above the ceiling, rain found a split slate and fell into a metal pan. Each drop rang through the building. A mouse moved behind the bins. From outside came the bitter scent of crushed walnut leaves and the distant bark of Nell, answering another dog across the ridge. Hazel returned to the front room before darkness settled. She swept one rectangle of floor with a hand broom found beneath the work table, laid her coat over 2 folded burlap sacks, and ate the heel of bread she had carried from Steubenville. Building cooled quickly. Through the broken roofline, she could hear wind entering above the kiln, yet the brick walls held a little of the day's warmth. Hazel placed the deed beneath the porcelain jar in her satchel, using its weight to keep the paper flat. Before lying down, she set Iris's wooden key tag on the floor where the green window light had been. The darkness was complete by 7. Hazel listened to the separate voices of the building, the pan beneath the leak, the walnut branches brushing slate, the shelves settling under their patient rows of porcelain. Then, from the rear workroom, something gave a single muted knock inside the wall. What the cork stopper kept paid for everything. At first light, Hazel carried a dented pail down the western slope and found the well beneath a collapsed lattice cover. The pump handle moved, but the leather cup inside had dried hard. She poured in rainwater from the metal pan, worked the handle slowly, and waded through 12 empty strokes. On the 13th, the pipe coughed brown water. By the 20th, it ran clear enough to wash with, though she boiled every cup she drank. The outhouse stood 30 yards behind the sample room, leaning toward a blackberry thicket. Hazel reset its door on the lower hinge, scrubbed the seat with lye found in a sealed tin, and marked the weak floorboard with white chalk. By the third morning, she knew the building's sounds. The long board beside the stove complained near its center. Two short boards outside the workroom clicked beneath the left heel. The rear threshold remained quiet, unless someone stepped close to the cabinet of glazed drawers. That was where the muted knock had come from, but Hazel did not open the cabinet yet. A sound in an abandoned building could be water, vermin, timber, or imagination. She intended to remove those possibilities in order. She walked back to Patterson Hardware after breakfast. The store smelled of machine oil, rope fiber, and floor wax. Nails were sold from wooden bins, hinges hung by size along one wall, and a belt-driven ceiling fan turned slowly without moving much air. The proprietor, Amos Patterson, wore a red wool sleeve over his right forearm to protect a burn scar that reached his wrist. Hazel placed the county deed on the counter. I need to make a chimney safe before the cold comes. Amos read the property description and looked over the top of the paper. Mercer Room has been empty longer than you've been alive. It is still standing. That is not the same as safe. No, sir. He asked what money she had left. Hazel told him the truth. Amos opened a ledger. I can give you a 30-day account if you work it down here on Saturdays. Sweep, sort screws, carry stock. Miss one Saturday, and the account closes. I'll be here. He wrote her name without asking for a guarantor, then gathered only what the chimney required. A wire flue brush for $1.85, 50 feet of quarter-inch rope for 90 cents, a dust mask for 35 cents, stove cement for 60 cents, and a galvanized stovepipe elbow for $1.10. From beneath the counter, he added a worn booklet titled, Repairs for the Rural Household. This costs nothing because half the pages are upside down, he said. The useful half still reads. Hazel returned by noon and began at the stove. She removed the elbow where the pipe entered the brick thimble, plugged the opening with a damp feed sack, and spread burlap across the floor. Then she climbed the outer wall, using an iron maintenance ladder fixed between the bricks. At the chimney top, she tied a fist-sized iron nut beneath the wire brush and lowered it into the flue. The first pull stopped after 6 feet. Hazel raised the brush, turned it, and let the weight fall again. Black creosote broke loose below with a sound like gravel, poured into a box. She worked the brush down and up in short strokes, never forcing it sideways against the old mortar. A hardened ridge near the bend required 43 passes. Soot entered her sleeves and settled around her eyes despite the mask. Twice she climbed down to empty the feed sack into a metal pail before continuing. The work took 5 hours and 20 minutes. When no more flakes fell, Hazel inspected the chimney with a hand mirror held inside the cleanout. A narrow square of daylight appeared above. 2 joints near the thimble had opened, so she pressed stove cement into them with a broken spoon and waited until morning before testing the draft. She burned twisted newspaper first. The smoke rose cleanly. Then she added dry walnut twigs and 3 pieces of split wood Walter Voss had left beside the lane. The stove answered with a low iron ticking. Hazel heated well water in a tin saucepan, stirred in oats from Patterson's damaged goods shelf, and added half an apple cut thin so it would soften quickly. It was her first hot meal in more than 2 weeks. She ate beside the stove while the room's damp odor lifted gradually into the chimney. Afterward, she opened the shutters and began recording what remained in the workroom. There was a brass beam scale with 1 missing pan, 7 porcelain testing rings wired together by firing date, a stoneware crock holding 3 hardened glaze paddles, an iron cork rasp with teeth fine as a file, 2 boxes of blank pharmacy labels, a foot-powered polishing wheel, and a rack of narrow-necked tooth powder jars, whose unglazed bases bore Iris's initials. Hazel stopped at the rack. The letters IQ had been scratched into the clay before firing. Not every piece carried them. On some jars, the mark was followed by a number, and the numbers corresponded to those on the test rings. She set one ring beside its matching jar. The glaze was pale blue, nearly gray in shadow, with a clean surface around the neck. Iris had once called that color river light. Hazel worked until sunset, cleaning only enough to expose shapes and markings. When she crossed the rear threshold carrying the pail, the two short boards clicked beneath her heel. A moment later, something answered from the cabinet. Not the wall, the cabinet. Hazel emptied each drawer in order, beginning at the bottom. Most contained porcelain chips wrapped in brittle paper. She tapped the drawer bottoms with the wooden handle of the brush and listened. The notes were thin and equal until she reached the pale blue sample drawer. Its bottom answered lower. She removed 12 glazed rings and 6 corks. The largest stopper was nearly 9 inches across, too broad for any jar on the shelves. Its surface had been darkened with wax, and a faint seam traveled around its lower edge. Hazel weighed it in one hand, then another stopper of similar size in the other. The waxed cork was nearly 3 times heavier. She shook it. Nothing moved. Using the scale's remaining pan and a set of brass weights, she confirmed the difference. 1 pound, 11 ounces beyond what solid cork of that size should have weighed. Hazel carried it to the work table. The seam resisted the point of her trimming knife. She warmed the cork near the stove, just enough to soften the old wax, then turned it slowly against the iron rasp. A thin ring of wax fell away. The bottom was not cork at all. It was a cedar disc fitted inside the stopper and stained to match. 2 shallow holes near its edge had been filled with glaze paste. Hazel cleared them with a needle, inserted the ends of a bent wire, and rotated the disc counterclockwise. It moved less than an inch. She stopped, cleaned the seam again, and tried once more. The cedar disc unscrewed in 4 deliberate turns. Air entered the hollow stopper with a dry, inward breath. Inside were 3 packages wrapped in oiled linen. Hazel removed the narrowest first. It contained Iris's trimming knife, a small steel divider, and the missing brass pan from the workroom scale. Each tool had been rubbed with grease before wrapping. The knife handle bore a shallow crescent where Iris's thumb had rested. The second package held 2 sealed paper packets of cobalt oxide, a cloth bag of finely ground feldspar, and 6 unmarked porcelain test buttons. The raw materials had been protected from moisture by a second layer of waxed paper. The third package would not bend. Hazel drew out a flat tin box, 6 inches long and 4 inches wide. A cotton cord surrounded it 3 times. Beneath the knot was an envelope bearing Hazel's name in Iris's handwriting. She did not open it. Not yet. She placed the envelope beside the porcelain jar from her satchel and lifted the lid of the tin box. Inside lay a savings passbook, 5 deposit certificates, folded kiln receipts, and several small paper rolls. Hazel opened the rolls one at a time. They held Mercury dimes, Washington quarters, Walking Liberty $50, and 11 silver dollars, darkened at their edges. At the bottom rested a victory medal dated 1919, its faded ribbon folded beneath the bronze. Hazel arranged everything on the cleaned work table. The coins totaled $12.83. She counted them twice, separating each denomination into straight rows. The passbook began with small weekly deposits under Iris's name. $3, $5, $8.50. Later entries became larger and appeared beside receipt numbers from Mercer's private kiln orders. The certificates had matured but never been redeemed. Hazel read each face value, checked its serial number against a handwritten list, and added the amounts on the back of a blank pharmacy label. 5,000, 6,000, 500, 7,000, 10,000, 12,500. Together, the certificates and final passbook balance came to exactly $41,000. Hazel placed both hands flat upon the table. She did not touch the money again for several minutes. The kiln receipts carried May Quinn's name, as well as Iris's. Several lines were underlined in red. Order delivered appeared beside payments smaller than the agreed amounts. On one folded sheet, a glaze formula had been written in May's narrow hand, followed by firing temperatures and corrections around the jar neck. Hazel turned the page over but found no explanation. That would be in the letter. Outside, the last light had gathered above the Ohio River. Hazel wrapped the certificates again, returned the coins and metal to the tin, and carried Iris's envelope to the doorway. She could have opened it beneath the lamp. Instead, she walked down to the well and sat upon its stone rim. Water moved far below, disturbed by drops falling from the pump pipe. The surface caught a thin piece of evening sky and held it without trembling. Hazel kept the unopened letter across her knees until darkness covered the lane. What the cork stopper kept paid for everything. Morning entered through the greenish window and reached the envelope before it reached Hazel's face. She carried it to the work table, set the brass scale beside it, and recognized the slanted Q in her surname. Iris had formed that letter the same way on glaze cards, beginning with a narrow oval and finishing with a tail that passed cleanly beneath the next word. Hazel opened the envelope along its sealed edge. The letter inside had been written on 4 thin sheets. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the large stopper, then the room has chosen someone more patient than the men who emptied it. I hope you came by honest means. I hope you know that ownership is only the first duty. Dr. Samuel Weller in Pittsburgh has diagnosed fibrosis of the lungs. He believes the pottery dust began its work years ago and that I have little time left. I can still walk to the kiln, but I can no longer climb the ridge without stopping. Our trade passed through 4 sets of hands. Eleanor Quinn began decorating pharmacy jars in Trenton, New Jersey. In 1867, her daughter Clara carried the work to East Liverpool in 1891 and learned kiln firing at Knowles. I entered Mercer in 1912 and developed the small-mouth glazes. My daughter May joined me in 1934, though the company placed my name on her formulas and paid her as a packer. 4 generations, 3 cities, and too many ledgers, written by other people. Mercer closed the sample trade on October 17, 1938. May stopped glazing soon afterward. Our family had already kept silent for more than 30 years about wages withheld, formulas taken, and women listed beneath work they had designed. I saved every payment I could prove was ours. The medal belonged to my brother Daniel. He died during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in October 1918. Keep it with respect, but do not let grief turn it into decoration. The pale blue formula is maize. Mix 4 parts feldspar, 2 parts kaolin, and 1 part silica by dry weight. Add cobalt 1 pinch at a time. Fire the neck rings to 2030 degrees. Hold for 20 minutes. Then cool without opening the kiln below 400. Grind cork only after it has rested dry for 24 hours. A good stopper should seal without demanding force. Behind the back door, find the blue marker beneath the walnut root. What lies there belonged to Eleanor. The money is not an inheritance because it carries our name. It becomes an inheritance only when someone uses it to protect the work, teach the hand, and leave the tools ready for another person. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Iris Eleanor. Quinn, February 12th, 1950. Hazel read the letter once with her hands resting beside the pages. Then she read it again, more slowly, pausing at every temperature and date. When she finished, she aligned the sheets by their upper corners and folded them along Iris's original creases. No new fold crossed the writing. The back door resisted until Hazel cleared damp leaves from its sill. Outside, the walnut roots had lifted the earth into ridges. She followed the western root named in the letter and found a square of pale blue porcelain pressed flat beneath moss. The marker bore a simple craft sign, a circle crossed by 3 kiln lines. Hazel loosened the soil with Iris's trimming knife. 4 inches below the tile, its blade touched fired clay. She removed a small porcelain lamp shaped like one of the tooth powder jars, with a brass wick fitting sealed inside its neck. Eleanor Quinn, 1891, had been scratched beneath the base. She cleaned the lamp with well water and dried the brass fitting beside the stove. A little lamp oil remained in a cabinet tin. Hazel trimmed the hardened wick, filled the reservoir halfway, and waited 10 minutes for the oil to rise. The flame began as a blue thread. Then it steadied into gold. Light passed through the lamp's thin porcelain wall, revealing shadows where Eleanor's fingers had pressed the clay more than 60 years earlier. Hazel placed it beside Iris's letter and May's pale blue formula. 3 women's work occupied less than 2 feet of table. She remembered Mrs. Wilcox preserving a key, no county office needed. Amos Patterson had opened a credit account for someone without an address and added a repair manual without charging her. Walter Voss had left split walnut wood beside the lane, cut short enough to fit her stove, and had gone home without knocking for thanks. None of them had rescued her. Each had simply made the next task possible. Most lives turn upon kindnesses too small to enter any official record. A warm room left open, a tool loaned without security, a meal placed where pride does not have to refuse it. Think back for a moment. What small kindness did someone once give you when you had no clear way forward? If you remember, tell us about it in the comments. That evening, Hazel carried the tin box to the clean rectangle beside the stove. She wrapped the metal in fresh cloth, set the trimming knife and brass divider near her pillow, and placed Eleanor's lamp where its low flame could not reach the wall. She slept with the heirlooms beside her and Iris's letter beneath the porcelain jar. The first snow arrived on December 3rd, leaving 6.5 inches across Irish Ridge and exposing every place where heat escaped through the roof. Hazel read the roofing chapter of Amos's repair manual 3 times. The building measured 24 by 36 feet, but each roof slope extended 19 by 38. Allowing 8% for cuts and breakage, she calculated 16 squares of cedar shingles, 1,500 square feet of felt, and 45 pounds of galvanized nails. Amos extended her account after she redeemed the smallest interest payment from Iris's passbook. From beneath his counter, he brought out a roofing hatchet with a square face and a blade polished narrow by sharpening. "My brother carried this 30 years, he said. "He won't be asking for it back." Walter sent Peter Dugan, a retired roofer whose white mustache collected frost when he breathed. Peter examined the split eastern rafter, then refused the envelope Hazel offered. "Pay me by keeping the roof dry." They worked 11 days. Hazel bolted a sound sister rafter against the split timber, stretched a chalk line across the first course, and learned Peter's 3-stroke method. 1 tap to set the nail, 1 square blow to seat it, and 1 light finish that left the shingle uncrushed. "That nail's proud. Strike it once more." Hazel studied the raised head. "It's crooked. Pull it." Bent nails split old wood. Wind stopped them twice, and melting snow soaked the felt before they covered the western slope. Peter showed her how to overlap each course 5 inches and stagger every joint so no channel ran straight downhill. On December 14th, Hazel drove the final ridge nail. The roofline remained slightly uneven where old rafters had bowed, but that night, snow fell, without a single drop reaching the metal pans below. In January, the chimney began shedding its outer surface. 3 bricks above the roofline had spalled deeply enough that their faces came away beneath Hazel's thumb. Mortar powdered from the joints and gathered on the slate like gray flour. She dismantled the crown 1 course at a time, marking each reusable brick with chalk. Peter warned her that Ordinary Portland cement would be harder than the old brick and could break it during freezing weather. Hazel mixed 2 parts hydraulic lime with 1 part sifted fire clay, adding water until the mortar held a clean ridge beneath her trowel. For 3 weeks, temperatures remained in the 20s. She warmed bricks beside the stove, carried them up in a canvas bucket, and covered each completed course with burlap before dusk. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes because gloves prevented her from feeling whether the joint had filled behind the brick. She climbed down, warmed her fingers around the stovepipe, then returned before the mortar surface dried. One morning, a repaired joint cracked because Hazel had mixed it too wet. She removed the entire course rather than conceal the line. The following batch held. On January 29th, after the final mortar had cured beneath its cover, she built a test fire from paper, walnut kindling, and 2 dry splits. Walter watched from the lane while Hazel checked the thimble and roof joint. No smoke entered the room. Above them, the chimney drew a straight gray column into the winter air. The floors waited beneath 50 years of glaze powder and ground-in soot. Hazel removed damaged sections near the back door and replaced them with white pine planks cut to the original width. Amos found a keg of hand-cut rose-head nails, their irregular heads close enough to those already buried in the boards. Hazel bored narrow pilot holes near each plank end so the dry pine would not split. She rented Patterson's random orbit sander for $14 per day and finished the work within 1 rental period. The first pass at 80 grit removed the black surface and old wax. 120 grit leveled the repair edges. The final pass at 220 left the grain closed and quiet beneath her palm. 3 thin coats of linseed and tung oil followed. Hazel wiped away every excess pool after 20 minutes and allowed 48 hours for the final cure. The boards changed from dark honey near the walls toward a deep mahogany color, where generations of workers had stood before the glaze table. Hazel left those darker paths visible. They were wear, not damage. There was one bad morning. She woke before dawn, dressed for work, and stood with the sander belt in her hand without fastening it. The silence inside the repaired room felt heavier than the labor waiting there. Hazel walked to a marshy backwater beside the Ohio River. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, with one leg folded beneath it. For nearly an hour, neither of them moved. When the bird finally opened its wings, Hazel remained on the bank. She did no work that day. The following morning, she returned to the floor and completed the 3rd coat. February brought the windows. There were 8 in all. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked beyond saving, and 1 contained a wavy pane reused from an earlier ridge house. The date 1788 had been scratched near its lower corner with a glazier's point. Hazel left that pane untouched, preserving its old putty wherever it remained sound. She removed the broken glass from the other frames, numbered each sash, and scraped the glazing beds without cutting into the wood. Amos supplied replacement panes and a tub of DAP 33 glazing compound. Hazel warmed the putty in her hands, rolled it into narrow ropes, and pressed it evenly along each rabbet. After setting the glass against the bedding layer, she drove glazier's points every 8 inches. Her putty knife traveled at a steady angle, shaping a bevel that sealed the pane while remaining below the interior sightline. The counterweights were still inside the wall pockets. She threaded 1/4-inch cotton sash cord over each pulley and secured it to the weight with a figure-8 knot. The restored sashes rose without scraping and remained wherever she placed them. On the 8th window, a corner of the replacement pane chipped as Hazel set the final point. She removed it, cleaned the bed, and began again rather than leave a weakness beneath the putty. By late afternoon, the new pane was secure. Hazel raised the sash 2 inches to test the cord. A chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch outside, its feet closed around the wet bark and its black cap tilted toward the room. For several seconds, Hazel and the bird faced one another through the clear glass. Then it flew toward the ridge, leaving the window open to cold February air. By late February, the repaired windows revealed how badly the interior plaster had failed. The original walls were horsehair plaster, laid over hand-split oak lath. Near the chimney, heat and moisture had loosened whole sections. Hazel's first patch cracked overnight. The second sagged between the laths. The third adhered at the edges but separated in the center when the stove warmed. Amos brought out an old feed bag filled with clean horsehair his brother had saved from a demolition job. Hazel cut the fibers short and mixed them into lime plaster until each handful held together without becoming stringy. She dampened the lath before applying a scored scratch coat, pressing firmly enough for the plaster to form keys behind the oak strips. The brown coat went on 3/8 of an inch thick and cured beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. A final 1/8 inch coat closed the surface without hiding its slight irregularity. Hazel ran her palm across the finished wall. These patches will hold another 100 years. People began leaving useful things at the door. Doris Vale, who owned a cafe near the lower end of Dresden Avenue, arrived wearing a blue apron with one pocket repaired in red thread. She set down paper bags containing bread ends, dried beans, and 2 pieces of apple cake. Hazel followed her to the lane with coins in her hand. Doris closed Hazel's fingers around them. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." A week later, 19-year-old Caleb Mercer rode up on a black Schwinn with a splitting maul tied along the frame. His front tooth was chipped, and the cuffs of his coat were too short for his wrists. He split the walnut rounds into stove lengths, stacking each row with the bark turned upward. Hazel offered him payment. Caleb shook his head. "My mother said, 'About your grandfather.'" He did not explain further, and Hazel did not press him. He tightened the maul to the bicycle with baling wire and rode home before dark. Reverend Elias Boyd passed the property each morning on his way to visit parishioners beyond the ridge. He was narrow-shouldered, walked with a polished black cane, and tipped his hat whether Hazel was on the roof, at the well, or carrying ash from the stove. When he saw the repaired chimney drawing clean, he stopped at the stone post, raised 2 fingers, and offered 4 words. "Keep these hands steady." Hazel answered by lifting her trowel. She postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door lay beneath a trap panel behind the kiln. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot floor, paved with fieldstone. Mineral deposits striped the walls, but there was no standing water. At the center rested a dressed granite slab, carved with the same circle and 3 lines mark found on Eleanor's blue marker. Hazel tested its edges with her fingers. The stone did not move, and she did not try to lift it. While cleaning the stair joints, she found a small oak box wedged beneath the 3rd step. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped like a tooth powder jar, complete with a narrow neck and rounded stopper. Beneath it was a tin type dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the sample room before walnut trees had hidden its brick walls. She held a glaze paddle across her apron. Her chin, narrow shoulders, and level gaze resembled Hazel so closely that Hazel placed the picture beside the cellar lamp to be certain she was not inventing the likeness. The inscription on the back read, "Clara Quinn, daughter of Eleanor Quinn, age 25, summer of 1903. Hazel carried the brass key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the victory medal. It fit none of the cabinet locks, neither outer door, and no visible fitting on the kiln. She left it where daylight could reach it. March loosened the snow along the lane. The creek below Irish Ridge grew loud with runoff, and greenish walnut catkins appeared where winter branches had seemed empty. Hazel decided not to begin full production that spring. The kiln still needed new elements. The glaze scale required calibration, and her hands remembered principles more clearly than procedures. She chose one mercury dime from Iris's coin rolls and spent it toward fresh material for a single test batch. She would practice on neck rings and small sample buttons until each firing became repeatable. There would be no hurried jars and no promises made before the glaze held. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 1956, Hazel completed her first full set of porcelain tooth powder jars. She had fired 28 trials before approving one. Some glazes crawled away from the rim. 2 batches blistered when the kiln climbed too quickly. A promising blue turned gray because she had measured cobalt beneath poor light. The successful jar emerged after a 20-minute hold at 2,030 degrees. Its glaze carried the quiet blue of river water beneath cloud. Hazel let it cool overnight, ground a close-grained cork after 24 dry hours, and turned the stopper gently into the neck. It sealed with Iris's soft whisper. Hazel left the jar on the work table for a week before making another. Each morning, she checked for moisture beneath the stopper and inspected the rim under magnification. The porcelain remained sound. The room around it had changed without becoming new. Restored white pine floors retained the dark paths of former workers. 8 clear windows admitted winter light. Eleanor's lamp occupied the shelf above the stove, while Iris's trimming knife hung beside May's glaze formula in a shallow frame that could be opened whenever the tool was needed. The sample drawers held labeled test rings again. None were locked. The brass key remained unanswered until a January wind split a heavy limb from the oldest walnut beside the back door. Hazel and Walter cut the branch into sections. Where it had joined the trunk, a narrow brass edge appeared beneath a collar of bark. Hazel cleaned the surface with a soft brush and uncovered a fitted plate bearing the circle and 3 lines craft mark. The key from the cellar entered its lock. A cylindrical copper box had been set inside a hollow in the tree and sealed behind the plate. The cavity remained dry. Hazel withdrew the box and carried it into the workroom before opening it. Inside was a folded 48-star American flag, its cotton darkened along the creases but untouched by rot. Beneath the flag lay a note written by Hazel Quinn on November 11, 1918, the day the armistice ended the fighting in Europe. I have placed this flag here for Daniel, though I do not yet know whether he is coming home. Clara says a tree is a poor safe because every tree must one day open itself to weather. I told her that is why I chose it. If our family finds this after the truth is known, carry the medal where his name is written. Then bring the tools home. Mourning should not be permitted to close the room. News of Daniel's death had reached the family after Eleanor sealed the box. The note had remained inside the walnut through 40 winters before Iris hid the medal separately in the cork stopper. On November 11, 1957, Hazel carried Daniel's victory medal to Riverview Cemetery in East Liverpool. His name appeared on a family marker despite his burial overseas. She laid the medal beneath a small, folded flag during the veterans' observance, then returned it to its cloth before leaving. There was no speech and no announcement. The money required slower decisions. Hazel redeemed certificates only when a repair, piece of equipment, or teaching expense had a written purpose. The roof, chimney, safe kiln wiring, and a modest living room behind the work area came first. She paid Amos's account in full and established a training fund through a local bank for adults who wanted to learn ceramic work but could not afford the materials. She never used the deposits to replace something merely because it looked old. Of Iris's loose coins, Hazel spent only 5. 1 mercury dime helped buy the first fresh cobalt. 2 quarters paid for mailing samples. A silver dollar purchased a used kiln shelf from a closing pottery. The remaining 2 coins bought notebooks for the first trainees. Everything else, the metal, tools, untouched coins, remaining certificates, formulas, and firing records, went into a cedar cabinet built beneath the glazed drawers. On its inside panel, Hazel painted 3 words. For the next one. The shop reopened without a newspaper advertisement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard. Quinn porcelain. Jar room small pharmacy jars. Made to order repairs. And glaze testing Girish Ridge Road. The first request came from a pharmacist who wanted 6 jars for a restored display. The second came from a dentist seeking covered porcelain cups. By spring, Hazel's mailing list held 43 names, written by hand and arranged by state. She accepted only enough work to keep the kiln full without rushing it. On Saturdays, 3 adult trainees used the sample table. Hazel charged those who could pay and drew from the training account for those who could not. Each person began with neck rings, learning how glaze gathered at a curve and why a stopper could not repair an inaccurate mouth. Caleb returned one rainy afternoon carrying a long object beneath canvas. He had become an apprentice sign carver and still rode the black Schwinn, though its rear rack had been repaired twice. He removed the covering outside the front door. The sign was walnut, carved by hand, and finished with oil. Its first line read, Quinn porcelain. Beneath it, in smaller letters, Caleb had cut jars, glazes, and daughters. Hazel traced the final words. There are no daughters here, she said. Not yet, Caleb answered. He meant no prophecy of blood or marriage. He meant May, Iris, Clara, Eleanor, and any woman who came through the door prepared to learn the work. Hazel understood that and did not ask him to change it. They mounted the sign beneath the old Mercer plaque. One named the company that had closed the trade. The other named the hands that had continued it. Years passed through measured batches. The training fund eventually paid examination fees and material costs for 7 apprentices, all adults beginning again after factories closed or families moved away. Some stayed only long enough to learn careful mixing. Others worked beside Hazel until they could identify an overheated glaze by its surface before touching it. May never came to the room. Hazel did not write, asking her to explain the silence at Ruth's dining table. She did not send photographs or copies of the underpayment receipts. May's formula remained credited in every ledger and printed beneath every pale blue test card. That was the only conversation Hazel chose to continue. On the 10th anniversary of the first successful jar, Hazel took out 4 sheets of thin paper. She placed Iris's original letter to her left and Eleanor's lamp to her right. Then she began her own. My dear one, whoever you are, if you are reading this, the kiln may be cold. Do not mistake that for failure. Check the chimney, test the wiring, and examine the shelves before you begin. The Riverlight glaze uses 4 parts feldspar, 2 parts kaolin, and 1 part silica. But the cobalt must still be judged beneath morning light. You owe this room no performance. Work carefully. Record what happened. Correct 1 variable at a time. If you cannot afford the materials, open the bank ledger marked training. If someone comes after you, leave enough for that person to make an honest mistake. Hazel paused there. Outside, walnut leaves moved against the windows. The floors gave their familiar clicks as one trainee crossed from the kiln to the scale. A jar cooled beneath an inverted bowl, protected from sudden air. Hazel continued writing until the light failed. She folded the pages along clean creases, sealed them inside a new tin, and placed the tin in a stopper she had hollowed and lined with cedar. What the cork stopper kept paid for everything. She returned it to the pale blue sample drawer, not as a secret fortune, but as a measured beginning. Instructions, proof, and enough means for another pair of hands to work without surrendering accuracy to hunger. Snow settled upon Irish Ridge, A lamp remained lit behind the greenish pane, and the chimney released one patient thread of smoke above the walnut branches. The porcelain tooth powder jar room waits. It has always waited. Years later, when Mrs. Wilcox retired, her replacement emptied the deputy clerk's lower drawer. Beneath the wooden Mercer key tag lay one worn dollar bill from Hazel's $6 payment, preserved between two sheets of deed paper. In violet ink, Mrs. Wilcox had written across the margin, "Keep with the room."